Hello everyone. In this session, we will be learning about what is the meaning of accounting, what is the meaning of financial transaction, example explaining how to identify the financial transaction. So let's begin. Let us see what is the meaning of accounting. Accounting, if you see by definition, accounting means a process of identifying, measuring, recording, classifying, summarizing, and interpretation of financial transactions. So now let's see this one by one. The first, identifying. Identifying means to determine whether a particular transaction is a financial transaction or not. Then measuring. Measuring means valuing that particular financial transaction in monetary terms. Okay. Third is recording. Recording of financial transactions means your passing of journal entries, posting of those journal entries in your ledger accounts. Okay. So each and every financial transaction needs to be recorded in the books of accounts. Then after recording the transactions, we have to classify. Classifying of the transactions means grouping of the similar financial transactions. Say for example, your assets, liabilities, expenses, income. Then again in assets you have various categories like fixed assets, current assets. In liabilities you have long-term liabilities, short-term liabilities. Expenses you have direct expense, indirect expense. Then income also you have direct income, indirect income, and so on. Then summarizing. Summarizing means preparing a statement using the financial transactions. Okay. For example, your balance sheet, your profit and loss account. And finally, we have interpretation. Interpretation is understanding how a particular entity is performing by looking at the summarized financial statements. Okay, so this entire process means accounting. Now, if you see the identifying, measuring, recording, classifying, summarizing, and interpretation of what? Of financial transactions. So to identify financial transactions, we must know what is a financial transaction. Okay, so let us understand what is a financial transactions. So this is the meaning of financial transaction. Whenever there is an obligation to give or take money, goods, services, assets for the purpose of business, it is known as a financial transaction. Now, this is very important. There are thousands of transactions that are taking place every day in the business, but we have to identify which of those are financial transactions. Only financial transactions are recorded in the books of accounts. So if you go by definition, there has to be obligation. Okay, that is, you should have a future obligation to give, either to give or to take what? Either to give or take the money from that particular person or entity, or either to give or take goods, or either to give or take some services, or either to give or take some assets. So if there is an obligation to give or take money, goods, services, assets for the purpose of business, again this is important. Every give and take should be for the purpose of the business. Remember, a person is different from the business. Okay. Financial transaction is also known as business transaction. Now, let us take one example and identify whether a particular transaction is a financial transaction or not. So now, let's see this example. Example of financial transaction. Mr. A has started a business of nursery and gardening services. His business includes providing gardening services, sale of plants, sale of seed and other related services. Now they have given the description and we have to identify whether a particular transaction is a financial transaction or not. Okay, first, Mr. Mohan has given a loan of rupees 10,000 for the business in cash. Okay, so Mr. A has obtained a loan from Mr. Mohan of rupees 10,000 for business in cash. So now this loan needs to be repaid. Okay, now there is an obligation, okay, to pay back this money in the future, and it is for the purpose of the business. So this is a financial transaction. Next, Mr. A has completed all the formalities related to opening a bank account with L&D Bank for the business. Thus, a zero balance bank account is opened for the business. Now, there is a zero balance bank account. Usually for all the businesses, there is a current account facility wherein you can keep a zero balance. Okay, so that bank account has been opened and all the formalities are completed. Now, if you see this transaction, there is no obligation to give or take any money, any goods, or any assets, or any services. Okay, so he has only opened a bank account, right? So, this is not a financial transaction. It need not be recorded in the books of accounts. Third, Mr. A deposited cash of rupees 5,000 in the bank account with L&D Bank. Okay. Now if you see, Mr. A, he has deposited a cash of rupees 5,000. Okay. So there is an obligation to deposit a cash in the bank account, okay, with the L&D Bank. So it needs to be recorded in the books of accounts. So this is a financial transaction. Next, Mr. A purchased gardening equipments worth rupees 5,000 on credit from PNC Limited. Okay, so for the purpose of business, he has purchased some gardening equipments worth rupees 5,000 on credit. On credit means he has obtained the asset but he'll pay it later. So if you see, there is a financial obligation. Okay, what is the obligation? He has received the asset, took the asset. What is the asset here? Gardening equipments. And there is an obligation to pay to Mr. PNC later. So this is also a financial transaction. Next, Mr. A paid for advertising in newspaper rupees 200. Now, Mr. A has paid. Whom he has paid? He has paid to newspaper for advertising. So, there is an obligation to pay, an obligation to receive services of rupees 200. So, this is also a financial transaction. Next, Mr. A signed a contractor agreement for labor with Mr. Vijay. As per the terms of contract, Mr. A is required to pay rupees 100 per hour as and when services are availed. So here Mr. A has signed a contract with whom? With a laborer known as Mr. Vijay. So as and when he will provide the services according to number of hours worked, Mr. A will be giving him 100 rupees per hour. So if you see, there is a only contract which has been signed. Okay. So as of now, no fixed services are being availed from him and there is no obligation to pay Mr. Vijay as of now. Okay. So obligation to pay and obligation to acquire his services will arise only when there is some business and Mr. A wants his services, then there will be an obligation for him to pay Mr. Vijay. So, as of now, only contract is signed, there is no financial obligation. So, this is not a financial transaction. Okay. Now, the next. Mr. A received his first inquiry from Ms. Sonakshi and he provided a quotation to customer for rupees 5,000. So, Mr. A has received an inquiry and he has provided a quotation. So, as of now, only quotation is provided to Ms. Sonakshi. So, Mr. A is not obliged to provide services to Ms. Sonakshi. Neither Mrs. Sonakshi is obliged to pay Mr. A. So as of now, this is not a financial transaction. So it need not be recorded in the books of accounts. Next, Miss Sonakshi confirms the order. She also gives rupees 2000 as advance in check. Now, here there are two things. One is Miss Sonakshi confirms the order. That is, the services are required to be provided. Now, Mr. A is obliged to provide services to Miss Sonakshi. And for that, she has paid rupees 2000 as advance. So, there is an obligation for Mr. A to provide services, in return of which Miss Sonakshi has given him 2000 as advance. So these are the financial transactions and it has to be recorded in the books of account. Then next, Mr. A purchases plants and seeds in cash for rupees 1000. So Mr. A, he purchases plants and seeds in cash. So there is an obligation to receive the goods and there is an obligation for Mr. A to pay in cash. So this is also a financial transaction. Now the next. Mr. Vijay, contract labourer, works for 8 hours and rupees 800 is payable to him as per the terms of the contract. Okay, so here is Mr. Vijay. We have seen in our earlier example. That is, we have seen it here in this transaction. Okay, so Mr. A, he has signed a contract with Mr. Vijay. Okay, so for payment of rupees 100 per hour as and when the services are availed. So accordingly, Mr. Vijay works for 8 hours and rupees 800 is payable to him. Now, what is it? Now there is obligation for Mr. A to pay Mr. Vijay for his services acquired. So this is a financial transaction. Next, client Miss Sonakshi pays balance amount of rupees 3000 in cash. Again, Mr. A has obligation to receive the balance amount from Miss Sonakshi for the services which he has given. So this is also a financial transaction. Then Mr. A pays a partial loan amount of 6000 taken from Mr. Mohan. So there was a first transaction wherein he had taken a loan from Mr. Mohan. So now he has paid a partial amount of loan. That is, there is an obligation of Mr. A to pay 6000 to Mr. Mohan. So this is also a financial transaction. So accordingly, we have to identify whether a particular transaction is a financial transaction or not. Hello everyone. Vanijya Vidya launches its educational site vanijyavidya.com. It comprises of courses related to accountancy and finance. Courses are aligned to specific academic syllabus and practical industry needs. 2 courses are live now. Courses comprise of virtual whiteboarding video tutorials with in-course knowledge checks followed by do-it-yourself quizzes and exercises. Course page contains details of the course, your instructor details, class curriculum and course preview. For more information and update, enroll to vanijyavidya.com. Thank you.